In 410 AD, across the hills, valleys, and forests of what we now call Britain, there is a strange, unsettling quiet. It stretches from the ancient roads of Londinium to the misty highlands of Caledonia, a quiet that feels thick with anticipation. Roman soldiers, who for centuries had been a common and reassuring sight, are disappearing. Forts lie empty, watchtowers abandoned, and the mighty Roman Empire, once so present, so dominant, seems to be slipping away. For 4 centuries, Britain had been a jewel in the Roman Empire. Roman roads webbed across the landscape, towns and villas dotted the countryside, and cities like Londinium thrived. The people had grown accustomed to the Roman way of life, embracing its stability, prosperity, and security. When Rome had first arrived in Britain, it brought immense change. The Roman army was a formidable force, one that transformed Britain from a land of warring tribes and mysterious druids into a thriving province of the empire. Under Rome, Britain became a more ordered place. Roads were built to connect towns and fortresses, aqueducts supplied fresh water to the cities, and fortified towns sprang up across the land. Londinium, the future London, became a bustling hub of trade and culture. Roman amphitheatres, baths, and temples emerged, where locals and Romans alike gathered for entertainment, worship, and relaxation. The people of Britain became accustomed to a life under Roman rule, adapting to Roman customs, speaking Latin, and even worshipping Roman gods. For many Britons, the empire had brought a new sense of identity. While they still remembered the ways of their ancestors, many adopted Roman customs and culture wholeheartedly. They learned Latin, wore Roman-style clothing, and celebrated Roman festivals. The presence of the Roman legions provided security, protecting the towns and villages from the constant threat of tribal raids. It was an age of relative peace and prosperity for Britain. Farmers planted new crops introduced by the Romans, towns thrived, and a network of straight, paved roads connected the countryside. The empire made its mark on every corner of Britain, leaving behind grand structures, well-maintained roads, and an economy that was intricately tied to the empire. But, by the early 5th century, the cracks in this Roman peace were beginning to show. The Roman Empire, once powerful and vast, was stretched too thin. It was a giant struggling under its own weight. The empire spanned from the icy hills of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt, covering vast territories that required resources, soldiers, and constant vigilance to maintain. As new threats rose on its borders, the empire was increasingly unable to hold back the tide. Barbarian tribes in Europe, including the Visigoths and Vandals, were pressing against the empire's defenses, forcing Rome to divert its legions to more urgent fronts. In the east, the Huns were a growing threat, sweeping across the land with brutal force. Rome's resources were being stretched to the breaking point, and Britannia, so far from the empire's heart, began to feel the impact. For those living in Britain, the situation grew more dire each year. The Roman legions stationed in Britain found themselves increasingly isolated, with fewer resources and reinforcements arriving from the mainland. Along Hadrian's Wall, the famed defensive barrier that had kept out the fierce Picts from the north, the soldiers found themselves battling not only the Pictish tribes but also a growing sense of abandonment. Hadrian's Wall, once a symbol of Rome's strength and determination, had held firm for centuries, its presence a constant reminder that Rome was there to protect the people of Britain. But as the raids from the north increased and fewer reinforcements came to their aid, the soldiers stationed there began to wonder how much longer they could hold the line. At the same time, a new threat was emerging from the east. Across the North Sea, the Saxons, a group of fierce and skilled warriors from modern-day Germany and Denmark, set their sights on Britain's vulnerable coastline. Saxons were known for their prowess in battle and their skill at sea, and as Rome's grip on Britain weakened, they saw an opportunity. Coastal towns and villages were sacked, their inhabitants either killed or taken as slaves. The Britons, used to the protection of Roman soldiers, found themselves increasingly vulnerable as the raids became more frequent and more devastating. To the west, Irish raiders also grew bolder, attacking settlements and plundering the countryside. Britain was now surrounded by threats, and the people felt the weight of their isolation. The Roman soldiers who remained in Britain tried to hold their ground, but their numbers were dwindling. Many of these soldiers were no longer foreign-born Romans but men born and raised in Britain. They had grown up in a world that was as much British as it was Roman, blending the customs of both cultures. They saw themselves as both Britons and Romans, bound by loyalty to the land they called home and the empire they served. But as the years went by, that empire seemed more and more distant. The command structure that had once connected them to Rome was faltering, and with each passing year, they felt increasingly cut off from the world they had sworn to protect. In 410 AD, Rome faced a crisis like none before. The Visigoths, led by their relentless king Alaric, were at Rome's very gates. The city of Rome, the heart of the empire, was under siege, and the emperor was forced to make an agonizing decision. Desperate to save the core of the empire, the emperor issued an edict declaring that Britannia was no longer under Roman protection. Britain was on its own. The legions were not coming back, and for the people of Britain, it was a moment of shock and disbelief. For centuries, they had been part of the empire, citizens under the protection of Rome. Now, they were abandoned, left to defend themselves against the rising threats without the support they had come to rely on. This was not a sudden event. Over the preceding decades, the Roman government, administrators, and wealthy elites had slowly begun to withdraw, seeking safer territories as the situation grew more unstable. Villas that once bustled with life and prosperity were left abandoned, their intricate mosaics gathering dust. Along Hadrian's Wall, the once busy forts were slowly vacated, their watchtowers left empty as the soldiers were called back to defend the empire's heart. The Britons had sensed this abandonment, but now it was official: Rome was not coming back. Without Roman governance, Britain began to fragment. The people, who had grown accustomed to the order and stability of Roman rule, found themselves facing a new, uncertain world. Local rulers and chieftains rose to power, each claiming authority over their territories. Small kingdoms emerged, led by men who had once served under the Roman eagle but were now carving out realms of their own. Some of these leaders clung to the old ways, preserving what they could of Roman customs and traditions. They ruled from crumbling villas, upheld Roman-style courts, and took on Latin titles, trying to maintain a semblance of the world they had known. But with each passing year, Britain became less Roman and more fragmented, as the old structures of power disintegrated. For the ordinary Britons, life became a daily struggle for survival. The roads, once safe under the watchful eye of Roman soldiers, grew dangerous. Bandits roamed the countryside, taking advantage of the lack of law and order. Trade, which had once flowed freely across the empire, slowed to a trickle, leaving towns and villages isolated. The grand structures of Roman Britain, the amphitheatres, the bathhouses, the temples, began to fall into disrepair, their stones and pillars taken for building materials. In many ways, the landscape itself began to revert to its pre-Roman state, as nature reclaimed the once grand towns and fortresses. Yet, even as the Roman way of life faded, its legacy lingered. The Latin language continued to be spoken, especially among the educated, and it began to blend with local dialects, giving rise to new forms of speech. Christianity, introduced to Britain by Roman missionaries, took root in local communities. The Christian faith mingled with native beliefs, creating a unique spiritual landscape that would influence British society for centuries. The roads, the walls, the aqueducts, all remained as silent reminders of the world that had once existed, a world that was now slipping away. In the wake of Rome's withdrawal, Britain entered a period of chaos and change. Local leaders, often former Roman soldiers, took control of territories, each establishing small kingdoms and waging wars for dominance. The land became a patchwork of independent realms, with no single ruler to unite them. Power shifted constantly, as alliances were made and broken, and new leaders rose and fell. It was a time of war, but also a time of resilience. Out of the ruins of Roman Britain, new cultures and identities began to emerge, laying the foundation for the kingdoms that would one day become England, Scotland, and Wales. For the Britons, this was a time of both fear and hope. They were forging a path of their own, blending the legacy of Rome with the traditions of their ancestors. Some leaders tried to uphold the Roman way of life, preserving what they could of the empire's influence. They maintained Latin titles, enforced Roman-style laws, and ruled from crumbling villas, clinging to the remnants of the world they had known. But others looked to their own heritage, reviving ancient customs and adapting to the new realities of life without Rome. Christianity spread, even as the old gods lingered in the minds of the people. A unique spiritual identity emerged, one that combined the teachings of Roman missionaries with the beliefs of the native Britons. The Christian faith provided a sense of unity and purpose in a time of uncertainty, giving the people a new source of hope and resilience. Churches were built, and Christian communities took root, creating a new foundation for British society that would endure for centuries. The end of Roman Britain was not just the fall of an era, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Britain, once a distant province of the Roman Empire, was now charting its own course. The Britons, left to fend for themselves, found strength in their independence, resilience in their traditions, and hope in their future. They would carry forward the legacy of Rome, even as they built a new world that was uniquely their own. Looking back, we see the year 410 AD as a turning point, a moment when one world ended and another began. The Romans left behind more than just ruins, they left a legacy that would shape Britain for generations. The roads, the walls, the Christian faith, and the traces of Latin in the language, all these are echoes of a time when Britain was part of something vast and powerful. The withdrawal of the Romans from Britain was not just an end, it was the start of a new story, a story of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring spirit of a people who, when left to face the unknown, rose to the challenge and found their own way forward.